Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce Rick Sykes, who's been a guiding force behind Santa Monica Alt Car Expo and formerly with the City of Santa Monica as our fleet director.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for coming to the 11th annual Alt Car Expo. It's a lot different, as you'll see if you were at the first one, where we had concepts and vehicles that weren't really available for sale. What we've got out there now with the OEMs with stuff that you can drive and buy. Our next speaker is David Hertz. He's the architect, founder, and president of SkySource, environmental architecture. David graduated with a bachelor's degree a long time ago. He's done a lot of great things, and I'm not going to have time to give his whole bio because he's got a short time to be able to talk to us today. But he is an award-winning work that's published and exhibited internationally. Some of the highlights include the Museum of Modern Art, the Smithsonian Museums of Natural History, and the National Building Museum, the Cooper Hewitt Museum, as well as the inclusion of the Venice and Istanbul Architectural Biennials, having won the American Architecture Award in 2009 and 2012, respectively. So with that, I'd like to introduce David Hertz.
Thank you, Rick. I'm going to put my stopwatch on here. I've got a short 15 minutes, and I was asked to talk a little bit about innovation. And I remember seeing a photograph recently, and maybe many of you have seen it, of New York City at the turn of the century, black and white photo, and you see a street full of horse and buggies. And it's hard to see, but there's one car in the background. And a very short time later, you see the same exact photo, and it's hard to find a horse and buggy. And of course, during that time, people said, oh, no one's going to try one of these newfangled automobiles, horseless carriages. And it was a disruptive technology that had huge influence in a very short period of time. And I think that we're at this point of innovation now, certainly when you look at the potentiality for the driverless car and what that will do to the future of cities from an urban standpoint. It may, in fact, in a short period of time, transform our cities, giving available space that was formerly in the domain of the automobile. And there's lots of, obviously, innovations happening with the transportation sector. I think from an architecture standpoint, people are looking at transit-oriented development. They're looking at ways in which we can be closer to the source and not be so auto-dependent. But when we have to be, how we do that efficiently, and emerging certainly with battery technology. So I've been interested in, I have invented building materials that look at what we take, make, and waste, and how we can use products discarded from our society. I did a house recently where I convinced a client to buy a decommissioned 747. For $35,000 for the price of a small car, we got a tremendous resource. We used the wings and the horizontal tail stabilizers as roofs, known as the 747 wing house in Malibu. So it's about radical reuse and repurposing. And I've been interested in architecture that's not only sustainable, but restorative and regenerative. And that's what we need to do. You know, we need to lessen our impacts of the built environment and give back more. We've been able to do that with energy, with photovoltaic. What we haven't been able to do on the architecture side is address our water issues significantly, because we're using 19% of California's energy budget to transport water long distances, which we don't have here. And so I've become interested in point-of-use water generation using atmospheric water technology. There's more water in the atmosphere at any given time than all the rivers on the planet. So we've got this ocean down the street evaporating in the troposphere. We only have 1.5% of all the water on the planet is on Earth in the form of rivers or aquifers, and we are usurping those aquifers at a faster rate than the Earth took 15 times that to make. So where do we harvest water? We've done a good job conserving. We're probably reaching somewhat the thresholds on conservation. Stormwater collection is great, and we need to do that, but we have too much in too short a time, and we can't store it. So how do we become water self-reliant as well as energy self-reliant? And I've become fascinated with this technology. It sounds like alchemy, making water from air, but it's not. It's here, it's available, and I see it as an emerging and disruptive technology. I currently use solar energy in my architecture firm off the Venice Boardwalk on Market Street. I generate about 11 kilowatts of electricity a day. I use about 3.6, and I make 150 gallons of fresh, potable water from the sky. And I don't need that water, so I give it away for free to the community. I put a bottle filling station in the alley in Venice, where there's a high percentage of homeless population, transient, that have a fundamental human right and trust to have water. You know, many people feel that water is a commodity to be privatized, and I feel that water is a fundamental right. And by harvesting it from the sky using solar energy gives us the opportunity to have water that is available and fresh. But I'm not giving away enough water because I'm still making more water than I can give away. So there's 82 community urban farm boxes in the Oakwood section of Venice. And when you look at those, you say, this is fantastic. We're doing urban farming for people in need that sometimes have a food desert. You know, a lot of people in the Oakwood section of Venice aren't going to walk to Whole Foods and spend the money for produce. They can get it, but we're in a drought. How do you rationalize having urban farming or lawns or green roofs or vegetative walls when we don't have water? And we use a tremendous amount of energy to get it. So I give about 300 to 500 gallons away for free to the Community Healing Gardens. And to do that, we employ 3 people from Safe Place for Youth. They are homeless kids that were aged out of the foster care system that were on the streets in Venice and now have full-time jobs. And they're water collectors. So they come by with a truck, not an electric truck or an energy efficient truck, but it should be. And they fill up the water from our atmospheric water generators, Skywater, and take it into the community and water the planters. So that food is then used with another program called Dharma Kitchen to feed the homeless population with the food. So it's this level of systems thinking. We take what's available to us. We take the nuclear energy that's about the right distance away. We use that to create energy. We make water as point of use. And I think what we're looking at with the distributed energy model, let's not take water long distances. Let's not take food long distances. Let's make energy at the source. Let's make water at the source. Let's grow food at the source. Let's create jobs at the source as close as possible. Let's not transport people or things long distances, which require a lot of energy. And so it's a model that ultimately, I think, can create jobs and look at innovation in a different way, and it's a small model. We're now taking that model with vertical aeroponic farming, and we're looking at drier climates where it's harder to make water, and we have a symbiotic relationship between indoor growing, which creates excess humidity, and we're capturing that heat and moisture to then make water. And so I think that there's a lot of innovations and technologies from biogasification using food waste, obviously saltwater batteries, other battery technologies for alternative energy. But the thing I've been most excited about lately, because it's next to air, probably the single most important thing is water. And in our area, of course, water will increasingly become critical, and I think atmospheric water technology is an innovation for point of use that goes along with some of the innovations that you're working on in transportation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Next Next, I'd like to introduce our Santa Monica City Manager, Rick Cole. Rick is a student of cities, and when we attracted him to be our city manager here in Santa Monica, it was quite a coup, having come from recently leading role in the Garcetti administration, but having led cities across the Southern California region and led change in each of those cities that made each one a better community. We're happy to have him here in Santa Monica, and he'll introduce our keynote speaker today.
Thank you, Terry. It's a real honor to work with the Santa Monica City Council because people are always bemoaning the lack of leadership. Always saying, we had strong, bold, courageous leaders, we could really do some things. We have creative, strong, and courageous leaders, have had them for a long time in this community, and that's why we've done a great deal. We were the first city in the country to have a sustainability plan. Now hundreds of cities have a sustainability plan. We were green before it was cool, and this is an example of how planting small seeds can grow into big things. The great Greek mathematician Archimedes said, "Find me a place to stand, and with a lever I can move the earth." That's leverage. You can move the earth if you are willing to take a stand and you work with others to make that leverage work. Doing this for 10 straight years has exerted leverage. It's had disproportionate impact on an industry that is now beginning to flourish. It's changing the way we look not only at the automobile and transportation, it's changing the way we look at cities. That kind of leverage, that kind of dedication, that kind of commitment, that kind of courage is what has motivated our next speaker. She spent more than 3 decades as an environmental lawyer, taking on some of the biggest and longest term and loneliest challenges out there. She took on the logging industry over their practices of strip mining the redwood trees, these extraordinary symbols of our state, but much more than that. These anchors of an ecosystem, a unique ecosystem that has survived for centuries. She's taken on other entrenched interests, she's battled them, and she's won. And so we're a greener, safer, and more prosperous California as a result. Sharon Duggan has now taken on perhaps the biggest challenge of all, the one we're all committed to her success in, which is taking on the challenge of climate change. It is an existential challenge for all of us. It's one that's directly connected to the work everyone here is doing. It is only if we exert all of our leverage that we can truly move the earth back in a direction that will keep us and our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren in a sustainable environment. That's what her work has been about. That's what she wants to talk to us about today, is how together we can stand up for our children, our grandchildren, and their grandchildren. Sharon Duggan.
OCT, I helped create OCT, and I'm not a lawyer on this case, but I'm on the board of OCT. And we are a nonprofit organization that enables youth empowerment to secure the legal right to a healthy atmosphere and stable climate for all present and future generations. We help coordinate and support local, federal, state, and international actions to secure a stable climate and for recognition and protection of the atmosphere as a public trust resource. And basically, OCT uses 3 tools. We have a focused education program and campaign, which includes an award-winning documentary film series, Stories of Trust, Calling for Climate Recovery, which features the youth voice and educates viewers about the need for urgent action. We also have a a youth-led campaign for training and supporting young people to engage in their local communities in civic participation, to help youth shape, present, and generate public support for legally binding, science-based climate recovery ordinances to reduce carbon emissions in a meaningful way. And an example of this is the ordinance that was enacted by the City of Eugene, Oregon in 2014, which mandates emission and use of fossil fuel reductions by the city and development of a carbon budget with a trajectory of reducing carbon dioxide levels to 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. And then the third tool that we use, which is what I'm going to focus on now, are the legal actions that happen in courts before city and county and state administrative agencies in order to enforce the public trust and constitutional duties by our governmental officials to protect natural resources, including the atmosphere, for the benefit of young people and future generations. And all of those items are on our website. I'm going to see if I can use this. I've never done a PowerPoint in my life, so bear with me. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So this is a slide that just kind of tells you generally about our Children's Trust. And the next slide tells you about the kinds of things that we do and our tools that we use. And then if we can go to the next slide. And this tells you about the case that I'm going to talk about. But our website is www.ourchildrenstrust.org. And this is the most recent campaign manual that we've put together to assist communities, young people in communities, to develop local climate recovery ordinances that are science-based. And if you want to learn about science and what is the basis for the 350 parts per million, it's in here, primarily authored by Dr. James Hansen, who's a world-renowned climate scientist. But today I want to focus on the federal action which you saw those young people about, because it is a tool of hope, in my opinion. The federal case is, to quote Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein, the most important lawsuit on the planet right now. So let me give you the who, the what, and the why. The who are 20 young people, ages 8 to 19, living in different states around the country. Dr. James Hansen, the world-renowned climate scientist, who is in the case as a guardian for his granddaughter and for future generations. And Earth Guardians, which is a youth organization representing young people as beneficiaries of the public trust. And they have sued the United States, President Obama and the Office of the President, and many federal agencies. Let me tell you about one of these young people, Jaden, who is 13 years old and lives in Rayne, Louisiana, a town in which approximately 80% of the people live below the poverty line. Like most residents in that community, her family has no flood insurance because they do not live in a flood zone. Yet, as we all know, last month, this area was devastated by flooding, ruining homes, causing sickness and even death. Jaden and her family were stranded in their home, scared as they tried to stop the floodwaters, contaminating their home with raw sewage and polluted water. They could not go outside with the water all around. There were no grocery stores open and no shelters available. Rains were steady and constant from August 12th through August 30th. Jaden and her family became ill with flu-like symptoms, with fevers, sore throats, headaches, stomach pain, and diarrhea. They were not alone, as many in their community were ill. This is what climate change looks like. While this is only one example, it's being repeated and happening around the globe with severe droughts and floods, food shortages, illness, and the melting of the world's ice sheets. We are at an urgent time because we clearly have reached atmospheric and planetary tipping points. What is this case about? These young people have sued the federal government because it has violated their rights as the youngest and future generations by knowingly allowing the atmosphere to become sick, infringing upon their basic human rights. Despite knowledge that carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels cause dangerous climate change, the federal government has perpetuated a hazardous situation for these young people and future generations, harming their rights to life, liberty, and property, and violating fiduciary public trust obligations as trustees to protect our air. Next slide. Young people seek a science-based recovery ordinance that will bring down CO2 emissions to 350 parts per million by the end of this decade. Next slide. There's two premises that these young people are using in court. The first is the Constitution, because the federal Constitution guarantees each of us the right to be treated equally and fairly, and the right to life, liberty, and property. Securing these rights at times have required judicial intervention, such as to secure voting rights, equal access to education, humane treatment of prisoners, and the freedom of choice to marry. Building on these intrinsic rights, these young people, like Jaden, assert their constitutional rights to be treated equally and provided their guarantee of life, liberty, and property with a healthy atmosphere. The other claim that is going forward is one for public trust, and I think we can go to the next slide if it's there. No, let me speak first about the public trust. Many of you may know about the public trust. It's a long recognized common law doctrine rooted in indigenous cultures and ancient Roman law that says that we can embrace some things as what belongs to all of us and is owned by none. Since ancient times, public trust resources include the air, the water, the sea and its shores, and the wildlife. And the government has a duty, an absolute duty, to protect those resources and to ensure that they're not harmed or lost due to inaction. As a public trust resource, the atmosphere must be protected and requires the government to exercise its duty and its authority to ensure its protection and prevent irreversible damage. And particularly to protect it so it doesn't cause harm to other public trust resources like water and our oceans. These young people are asking that the political branches of government fulfill their trust obligations to avoid destruction or irreversible harm to the public trust asset of the air, our atmosphere, which must be sustained for future generations. And as to the constitutional rights, the federal government is illegally denying these rights by causing or contributing to a dangerous concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere, destabilizing our climate system. They seek to stop the federal government from continuing, next slide, through its actions and lack of action to deny these fundamental rights. They seek the science-based recovery plan that will stabilize our climate system and protect vital resources for which they must have in order to have a livable future. So why this case? This is a bit of a history lesson, and I ask you to bear with me because it really speaks to what Dan was speaking about earlier in terms of, how the time has passed and the clock is going much faster. 50 years ago, in 1965, 50 years ago, next slide, the White House documented that CO2 emissions from fossil fuels would create dangerous climate change with enormous and harmful impacts to future generations, threatening the health, longevity, livelihood, recreation, cleanliness, and happiness of citizens who have no direct stake in their production, but cannot avoid their influence. The White House found, next slide, that pollutants have altered on a global scale the CO2 content of the air through the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas. Next slide. CO2 will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur, and carbon dioxide gases are accumulating in such large quantities that they may eventually produce marked climate change. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, this is my initial effort at doing a PowerPoint. The recognized consequences of this include the melting of the Antarctic ice cap, rising sea levels, warming oceans, acidifying waters, and additional releasing of carbon dioxide and methane due to these events. The White House in 1965 proposed a tax system to tax polluters in proportion to their contribution to pollution. A few years later, Patrick Moynihan, who was then advisor to President Nixon, advised that carbon dioxide pollution resulting from burning fossil fuels was a problem perhaps on the scale of apocalyptic change, and urged the government, again in 1967, to immediately address this threat. Next slide. 25 years went by until 1990 and 91, when the EPA and the Office of Technology Assessment presented two separate reports to Congress. In 1990, the EPA advised that the response to the greenhouse problem that to be undertaken now will be felt for decades in the future. And the lack of action now will similarly bequeath climate change to future generations. The EPA called for three things: a 50% reduction in total US CO2 emissions from below 1990 levels by 2025 as the only pathway to achieve Congress's goal of stopping global warming and stabilizing the climate system. It recommended to stabilize the atmospheric CO2 concentrations at 350 parts per million, as that was the level in 1990, and to impose a carbon tax on polluters. This was followed in that next slide, in 1991 by the Office of Technology Assessment, which identified the United States as the single largest contributor to carbon pollution and called on our country to act so as to provide leadership around the world. Next slide. The OTA stated that an energy conservation, energy supply, and forest management package that can achieve a 20 to 35% emissions reduction is needed, which if implemented could lower CO2 emissions 35% from 1987 levels by 2015. This reduction would only be the beginning, and further efforts would be needed. And importantly, the level of emissions reductions needed requires the country to wean itself from fossil fuels. And as with the White House in 1965 and the EPA the year before, the OTA recognized that the decision to limit emissions cannot await the time when the full impacts are evident. The lag time between emission of the gases and their full impact is on the order of decades to centuries. So too is the time needed to reverse any effects. Now here's the thing. Neither the EPA nor the OTA proposals were ever implemented. Next slide. Instead, nearly 20 years later, in 2009, the EPA issued a formal endangerment finding. The current and projected atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, including in particular CO2, threatened the public health and welfare of current and future generations. Next slide. Now, in the face of this, and to this day, the federal government subsidizes the fossil fuel industry at a cost of roughly $4 billion per year. It authorizes excessive fossil fuel production of coal, oil, and gas on our public federal lands. It subsidizes and funds fossil fuel production and consumption. It allows all interstate transport of fossil fuels. It authorizes and/or permits the exploration and importation of fossil fuels and their related facilities, and it authorizes the combustion of all fossil fuels in the U.S. Next slide. And as a result, by 2011, fossil fuel consumption in the U.S. accounted for 92% of our CO2 emissions. In 2012, the U.S. was the largest producer of natural gas. 2014, we were the largest producer of total petroleum and other liquids. And by 2015, we're by far the dominant producer of both shale gas and crude oil from shale formations. Even though eliminating these preferences for the fossil fuel industry would provide fiscal savings, would not materially impact our energy security, and could influence our leadership around the world to deal with climate change, they continue in the midst of this crisis. Astoundingly, at the same time that Jayden and thousands were placed at risk in Louisiana last month, the federal government held an auction for offshore oil and gas drilling leases in the Gulf of Mexico for an area the size of Virginia. Next slide. The federal government continues to allow onshore and offshore oil production in the United States to reach the highest levels in the history of our country, from $9.4 billion per day in 2015 to a projected $11.3 billion per day in 2040. And these are statistics that are coming. I have some slides at the end that will show you the graphs. They come right out of the Department of Energy's website from this year. In the next slide. Next slide. Okay. This is the one that shows the difference in the amount of barrels and the increase. In the next decade, our fossil fuel production will outpace our consumption, and we will become a net exporter of fossil fuels, contributing to the global use of fossil fuels. Next slide. This is the slide that shows that increase. And I think we go to the next slide. As of 2015, consumption of fossil fuels in the United States, natural gas, coal, petroleum, and other liquids, accounted for 81% of energy consumption. By 2040, it will still be at 79%, or 77% if Obama's climate clean power plan is implemented. By 2040, fossil fuels will dominate our energy consumption, with oil, gas, and coal continuing to be far greater than all other energy sources combined. Moreover, next slide. One more slide. Yes. This year, the Department of Energy documented that the level of emissions will flatten by 2040, well above 350 parts per million, which means that the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere will continue at that higher rate. And as we noted earlier, it'll take decades, if not centuries, to deal with that. This is not a roadmap to stabilize our climate system, to allow more than 75% of our energy supply to come from fossil fuels, when we know that to reduce CO2 emissions to a level which is livable for these young people, we should use only 5% fossil fuels for energy. Next slide. And the next slide. Contrast this scenario with what would have happened had the EPA's 1990 recommendations been implemented, reducing emissions 50% below 1990 levels by 2025. And that's what those two lines there show. One shows the EPA's projection at 50%, and the other one shows what is needed. which is a 6% reduction per year starting this year. President Obama's Clean Power Plan does not change this scenario because the plan is not tied to any scientific calculations that are predicted to stabilize our climate. Instead, it is tied to insufficient emission reductions based on a high emission year, 2005, which will allow our nation's carbon pollution to continue at dangerous levels for decades, preventing the stabilization of our climate system. Current plans do not fix this scenario. This is the legacy that our government is giving to these young people, to your children, and our grandchildren. And this is why these young people have taken the extraordinary action to sue their government. In the face of decades of science calling for immediate action and the federal government's ongoing failure to act with simultaneous and significant support for the fossil fuel industry, it is clear that the government is not protecting the rights of all young people and future generations. Not agencies with regulations, not Congress with laws, and not the office of the president. The best science instructs that we now need not a trigger of so many percent by so many years, but 6% reduction starting this year and next year and the year after. A 6% based upon what happens after after coming down 6%. A very different calculation than just targeting 50% by some date. If we're to stabilize atmospheric carbon dioxide levels at 350 parts per million by the end of this century. After the case was filed in 2015, as you heard at the outset, the fossil fuel industry, representing virtually every petrochemical and petroleum manufacturing interest in the United States, entered the case to defend the federal government. These 21 young people now face the government standing shoulder to shoulder with the pollution industry, with all of their combined financial, organizational, and political resources. Together, they tried to have the case dismissed. They argued that the court should not do anything, it should be left to the agencies, to Congress, to others. And the federal judge in June refused, finding that that the case is presented by the use, and I'm going to quote here, "The failure to regulate emissions has resulted in a danger of constitutional proportions to the public health. Presumably, sweeping regulations by the EPA alone could result in curtailing of major CO2 producing activities by not just the defendant agencies, but by the purported independent third parties as well." Now, the way these federal courts work, that decision was reviewed by another judge just this week on Tuesday. And while no final decision has been issued, we're confident that the case will proceed. At the hearing, the court recognized and had the government and the fossil fuel industry concede that we have a serious, complex, and systemic problem. And while the government argued to the judge that there are plans in place to address the problem, the court questioned whether current plans are fixing the problem and commented that it is not right or fair to expect these young people to challenge each and every regulatory approval or approach. Recognizing the harm these young people face, the judge posed the question, who is going to speak for these young people if not the courts? Ultimately, the youth will present indisputable science, which imposes a duty and compels the federal government to act to protect these young people and future generations from a loss of their basic human rights. and to protect their rights to clean air and the pursuit of life, liberty, and property. Wes Stevenson, who is a former editor of The Atlantic and the Boston Globe and a climate activist, has elaborated on activists' efforts to deal with climate change in his book entitled, "What We're Fighting For Now Is Each Other." In his words, "What we're fighting for now is each other. We have to fight for the person sitting next to us and the person living next door to us, for that person across town and across the tracks from us, and for the person across the continent and across the ocean from us. Because we're fighting for our humanity. Ours is now a fight for survival and a fight for justice. No, for the survival of the possibility of justice and some legitimate hope for what Martin Luther King called the beloved community, even as we struggle to survive." Thank you for doing what you do as you work to provide alternatives to fossil fuel addiction. And please do more in your communities, in your agencies, to achieve science-based climate recovery and provide a livable future for our children and grandchildren. As author and botanist Terry Tempest Williams tells us, I think you can go to the last slide. The eyes of the future are looking back at us, praying for us to see beyond our own time. Thank you.